It was Saturday night, and the sun had just set, creating a twilight that made it difficult to tell whether or not to turn on the headlights. Mark Evans didn't have to make that decision because he had already pulled into his garage, located on a quiet residential street in Sharpsburg. Soon, a slender, dark-haired man came out of the side door, carrying a briefcase, and a laptop bag in his hands, thanks to years of experience handling three bulky items with ease. It was impossible to travel as much as he did without developing such skills. He opened and entered the side door of his house, but did not call his wife Lisa to inform her of his return. He already knew that she was not at home. Instead, he walked into the living room with his briefcase and laptop, leaving his briefcase at the foot of the stairs leading to the second floor of their modest but cozy home. He placed the two items on the sofa, took off his coat, and took it to the closet by the front door, where he hung it on the usual coat rack. Only now, with both hands free and in the comfort of his own home, did he take off his jacket and tie and unbutton the top two buttons of his white shirt. He usually didn't wear such formal business attire, but today he returned from a regional management meeting for ABC Industries. He wasn't technically in management, but his role as the most knowledgeable systems analyst in the enterprise required his presence at meetings in Pittsburgh. His immediate supervisor was good at organizing staff, but knew virtually nothing about the computer systems that kept their business running smoothly. He could have returned home the night before, but that didn't suit his plans. Instead, he told his wife that after the meeting there would be a series of seminars that would last the entire weekend, and that he would return on Monday. He had his reasons for this, and he had to waste most of the day in order not to return home too early. He would also wish to pack more comfortable clothes for this trip, but if he did, Lisa might wonder why he would need to. He never wore anything other than business attire to these regularly scheduled business meetings. Now that he was home, the first thing he did was take a shower and then change into more comfortable clothes. 20 minutes later, after he had disappeared upstairs with his backpack, he returned to the ground floor dressed in his usual jeans and polo, freshened up after a quick shower. He spent the next half hour selecting, heating, and then eating food from the leftovers in the refrigerator. Lisa was a good cook, and even her leftovers were delicious. He washed down his meal with a bottle of light premium beer, one of his few weaknesses. By the time he finished drinking his beer, he had moved into the living room, where he was stretched out on a la Z-boy chair and reading the front page of the local newspaper. To any casual observer, he was a typical husband relaxing after a long and difficult trip. In reality, he was simply stalling for time, strictly following his plan, patiently waiting for the chosen time to bring his personal crisis to an end. He had a month to go through the 5 stages of grief alone, and in truth, the only stage he handled successfully was denial. Anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance still played a role at the moment. He hoped that he could advance several of the remaining 4 stages during the night. It was past midnight and Sunday had just begun when he was finally satisfied with what his watch was showing and stood up to return the empty bottle of beer to the kitchen counter. While there, he moved the dirty dishes into the dishwasher and wiped the table with a damp cloth, returning it to a clean state. He knew by doing these small things that it was just a way to linger so that his doubts and fears would force him to reconsider the path he had chosen. When no new solution to his problem presented itself, he went to the hallway closet for a light jacket and then headed to the side door, beginning his nightly mission. When his fingers touched the doorknob, he suddenly pulled his hand away, snapped his fingers, and said, "Damn, I almost forgot." He hurried back into the living room, placed the case on the coffee table, and then placed the laptop on the case. In less than a minute, he turned on his laptop, logged in, and connected to the internet through the wireless router located in the computer room he and Lisa had set up. A few minutes of typing and emailing completed the forgotten tasks, and after logging out and turning off the laptop, he returned to the side door, confidently and leisurely leaving the house. After spending about 5 minutes in the garage, he lifted the garage door, pulled out onto the street, turned on his headlights, and drove away slowly as the garage door closed silently behind him. At 7:37 a.m., The Sharpsburg 911 operator responded to a new incoming call. This is your 911 operator. What is the nature of your emergency? A vague female voice, seemingly young, answered the apparently bad phone connection. I think I need the police. I think a crime has been committed. The 911 operator continued coldly, "Where are you, madam? We need your location to dispatch the police to a call." I'm on Park Drive, at the phone booth on Park Drive next to George Washington Park. The word phone booth immediately explained the poor connection to the operator. What type of crime was committed, madam? Were you attacked or robbed? There was a slight slowdown before the young woman responded, "No, it's not me. I'm fine. I just ran through the park on the paved road that goes around the picnic areas. There's a car parked outside one of the picnic areas. The doors are open, the light is on inside, and there is blood." Now, the 911 operator was very interested in the call and asked, "Will you need an ambulance? Is there anyone injured?" "No, there is no one there who was injured. At least I didn't see anyone there. There was only an empty car there." A few seconds passed before the woman continued, "I didn't look around too much. I was afraid that someone might come after me, so I ran here to the phone booth to call you." "You did the right thing, I'm sure. The car has already left and should be there in less than 10 minutes. Please wait for the officers so you can tell them exactly where this car is." The caller, sounding a little worried, replied, "No, I'm not going to wait here. What if whoever did this comes for me? I'm going to go straight home." Her last words were followed by a click as she hung up. The 911 operator stared helplessly at the screen as the flashing image of the caller's number disappeared after the phone was hung up. Damn, I guess it was just her idea for a joke. Well, I hope I didn't distract these officers from something more important than their coffee break. It was almost 2 o'clock that Sunday afternoon when Detective Peter Nesbitt suddenly sat up straight in his chair as he saw a car turn into Evan's driveway. He was getting out of his unmarked car when the beautiful, short-haired blonde driving the car stopped him in front of the garage. He was walking quickly across the street when she got out of the car, and he quickly said, "Excuse me. I'm looking for Mrs. Evans." She turned, grabbing her duffel bag from the seat next to her, and answered, "I'm Lisa Evans." She looked at the detective a second time and continued, "Do we know each other?" "No, ma'am. I'm Detective Peter Nesbitt with the Sharpsburg Police Department. I'm here about your husband, Mark Evans. We're trying to locate him after his car was found abandoned in George Washington Park this morning." He quickly returned his ID and badge to his pocket. Lisa Evans' face took a moment of serious concern before she said, "Mark is in Pittsburgh. He always leaves his car at the airport when he goes on these trips, so I don't know how it could have ended up in the park. You're wrong." By this time, Detective Nesbitt had already approached her and continued, "No, we are absolutely sure that this is his car. The license plate and VIN match his registration." Her face now showed confusion, and she slowly walked towards the side door of her house. "Well, if it's his car, then it must have been stolen from the airport. I don't know what else to tell you." The detective was quite persistent and spoke again. "When was the last time you spoke to your husband? Can you call him now so we can make sure he is still in Pittsburgh? Does he have a cell phone that we can call?" Lisa Evans stopped abruptly and turned to the detective. She placed her travel bag on the ground next to her and began searching for her cell phone in her bag. "He called me yesterday afternoon from Pittsburgh. If it makes you feel better, I'll call him right now." She punched a few numbers into her phone, eager to show the detective that her husband had not been at the park. A moment later, the cell phone began ringing in the detective's jacket pocket. He took it out and held it to his ear before saying, "Hello, Mrs. Evans." The expression of surprise on Lisa's face was absolutely sincere. After a moment, when the shock had subsided, she said, "Where did you get my husband's phone number?" The detective turned off the phone and put it back in his jacket pocket when she said, You need to give me back my husband's phone. He must have lost it. I'm afraid I can't, Mrs. Evans. This is now evidence of a possible serious crime. It was found on the floor of your husband's car. Lisa was again concerned and asked, "Serious crime? What do you mean?" "Your husband's car was found early this morning in the middle of George Washington Park. The doors were open and there was a bullet hole inside the passenger seat. We searched the park thoroughly but did not find anyone who might have been a victim of violence. We really need to find your husband. To rule him out as a victim or suspect, can you call him at the hotel in Pittsburgh?" Lisa turned towards the house, picked up her travel bag and said, "Sure, I can do it. I have the hotel number in my notebook. He always stays at the same Holiday Inn. I'm sure he just forgot his cell phone in the car, and that's why he was there when his car was stolen. Come in and we'll straighten it out." Detective Nesbitt followed her into the kitchen and watched as she set down her bag and wallet, found her address book, and quickly began dialing a phone number, looking absent-mindedly across the hallway into the living room. He clearly heard the hotel manager say, "Hello, hello," as she hung up. As she hung up the phone, her face turned pale, and she quickly said, "Mark was home. His briefcase and laptop are on the coffee table in the living room. I don't understand anything." The detective had a thoughtful look on his face as he pulled his cell phone out of his inside pocket. He quickly dialed the number and said, "Hey, Dave, Pete is on the line. I need you to contact the duty prosecutor. I want a search warrant for the Evans home. We need to search the place to decide whether Mr. Evans is the victim or not. Potential suspects. Bring it here as soon as you get it. I'll be waiting." He hung up and sat down opposite Lisa. "A search warrant. Why do you need one? You can look at anything you want. Just ask. I want you to find my husband." Detective Nesbitt looked at Lisa blankly and said, "I want to do everything legally, ma'am. If I conduct an illegal search and your husband turns up involved in something illegal, then whatever I find may not be admissible in court." Lisa was a little annoyed and quickly replied, "Illegal? Mark isn't involved in anything illegal. He works with computers, for God's sake." "Well, something brought him back to town unexpectedly. Can you think of any reason why he might be here unexpectedly and without the knowledge of you, his wife?" Lisa's face turned pale again, and she quietly muttered, "God, no. He can't. Oh, no." A panicked look appeared on her face, and she silently looked at the detective for several seconds. Finally, she said, "I don't know why my husband came home early. I just know he's not involved in anything illegal." Her face gradually took on an expression of complete panic, and she continued, "Oh God, Mark might be injured, lying somewhere and waiting for help. You have to find him." Seeing how upset she was, Peter Nesbitt's compassionate side took over, and he spoke to her much more gently. "We don't know anything for sure yet, Mrs. Evans. As a police officer, I have to do the right thing. At the moment, there is no evidence that your husband did anything wrong or that he was even involved in this. Why don't you cook for us? Coffee while we wait for my partner with the warrant. There's nothing more we can do right now. All of our duty personnel are looking for or keeping an eye on your husband." His sympathetic tone and comforting words seemed to help Lisa as she began to relax, and some of the natural color returned to her face. She stood up and started making coffee for the two of them. Her calm state did not last long, however, as with his next proposal Lisa became tense and worried again. This all happened when he said, "Perhaps while we're having coffee, you can tell me how you spent the last 48 hours. Before this case is closed, we'll probably need statements from everyone who was in any way involved." Detective Nesbitt decided to wait a few minutes before taking a preliminary statement from Lisa Evans, and she seemed reluctant to broach the subject herself. Instead, the two of them sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee while the detective recounted the details of how the car was found and the condition it was in. Lisa seemed shocked by some of the details. He also described that there was evidence that a second bullet had been fired into a body leaning against a piece of wood on the ground next to the car, and that bullet was in the process of being removed for testing in their forensic laboratory. The car was towed away for inspection and evidence was still being collected from it. Finally, he reported that the medical examiner and forensic investigator were still examining the scene in detail. They had just started their second cup of coffee when Detective David Klein, Peter Nesbitt's partner, arrived much faster than expected with the search warrant that had been requested. He was accompanied by 2 forensic technicians, and soon the 3 new arrivals began a systematic and thorough search of the Evans home, and then Lisa's garage and car. While this was happening, Detective Nesbitt arranged for Lisa to locate her husband's razor and toothbrush so that DNA could be obtained to compare with the blood samples they had. Throughout the search, especially when it came to DNA comparisons, Lisa was so stressed that Detective Nesbitt was eventually forced to take her to the living room, where he asked her to stay on the couch while he joined the others to complete the search of the house. After an hour of seemingly fruitless searching of the house, detectives decided that the only things they would need to take from the station, other than DNA samples, would be Mark Evans' briefcase and laptop. Detective Nesbitt had already discovered that the computer was password protected, and they would not be able to access it until they found a way to bypass it. "Mrs. Evans, do you happen to know your husband's password for his laptop?" This question seemed to bring Lisa out of her state of despair and occasional tears, as it seemed like something she could help with. "It used to be his name followed by his year of birth. Try Mark 1D971. This should be it." Unfortunately, it soon became apparent that he had changed his password, as none of the old variations worked for the detective. "It's okay, Mrs. Evans. We have computer experts in our forensic department who will find a way to bypass your husband's password. With any luck, it won't take long." 2 items were tagged and transferred to a van used by 2 forensic technicians. Left with Lisa Evans, Detective Nesbitt decided to revisit the topic of obtaining her preliminary statement. "Well, Mrs. Evans, I need to get the basic facts about your whereabouts this weekend. Let's just cover Saturday morning until you return home this afternoon." He took out a notepad and pen, ready to write down her description of how she spent the specified period of time. Lisa Evans took a deep breath and began, "Well, I was doing the usual household chores until noon on Saturday. Mark called me from Pittsburgh at about an hour, or maybe 1:30. We only spoke for a few minutes. He said it was a pity that he can't be home for the weekend. After that, I went shopping until about 4:30 and then returned home around 7:30 p.m. I went to a friend's house and stayed with her for the night. Woke up late in the morning in no hurry, and as you know, I returned home at about 2 o'clock. She seemed to become increasingly tense as her explanation continued, and by the time she finished, she was looking at the floor and rubbing her hands together. As he wrote the last word of her explanation into his notebook, Detective Nesbitt closed it and tapped it with his pen for a few seconds before he said, "We may need more details, Mrs. Evans. This will do for a start, but be prepared to provide more details and exact time frames if circumstances require it." He put the notebook and pen back in his pocket before standing up. Detective Nesbitt was about to leave the house to join the others who were searching the garage and Lisa's car. He was confident that the house had been thoroughly checked when he suddenly realized that he needed one more item. "Oh, Mrs. Evans, do you have any recent full-length photographs of your husband? A good portrait would also be useful. We only have his photo from the driver's license database for now. Something less formal would be better for distribution to the patrol officers." With that, he walked over to the mantelpiece, where he looked at several wedding photographs until Lisa Evans quickly walked over to the bookshelf, from where she selected a thick photo album. "Here are some good recent photos, Detective. Take your pick." She returned to the couch, and the detective sat next to her as she opened the album. The last page of the book had some very good photographs for his purposes. Perhaps the best one included Lisa standing to Mark's right, while a tall, well-built blonde man stood next to him on his left. "This one will do," the detective said, pointing to the group photo. "We can cut you and this other guy off." After a few seconds, the detective selected another photo, a very good portrait of Mark Evans. "These 2 photographs are more than sufficient for our needs." When Lisa removed 2 photos from the album and handed them to the detective, he looked at them again and asked, "Is that guy in the photo with you and your husband a relative of his? If he has a brother or a parent from whom a DNA sample can be taken, it may be helpful if they can't get anything useful from a razor or toothbrush." Lisa quickly responded, "No, this is Blake Moore. He's been my husband's best friend since high school. My husband has no family living nearby." After thanking her for the photos, Detective Nesbitt went to join the others in the garage. He left Lisa sitting at the kitchen table, looking despondent and on the verge of tears. He began to think that he felt sorry for this woman and her situation. Her husband is missing and may have been involved in a serious shootout. The fact that she didn't know he was even in town made the detective wonder what exactly was going on. Detectives, along with 2 forensic experts, soon finished searching the garage and car. During a thorough inspection of Lisa's car, technicians noticed something potentially important and definitely suspicious. It was decided that the car would be towed back to the garage for a thorough inspection and testing. While the 2 technicians packed their equipment and prepared to leave, the detectives stepped aside to discuss their thoughts on the case. Detective Nesbitt, standing so that he could look back at the side door of the Evans house, said to his partner, "What is your opinion of Mrs. Evans? I've had different thoughts about her, and this positive blood test on the pedals of her car really gives me pause." "Well, you have an advantage since you talked to Mrs. Evans. I was only here for the search. She seemed like a typical uptight wife, but you know how that goes. Right now, I wouldn't want to bet money on whether she's involved in something or just what it appears to be." Nesbitt suddenly walked towards the side door, saying as he went, "Come with me, Dave. Let's see how she reacts when we tell her." The 2 detectives walked to the side door, knocked, and entered. Lisa Evans was talking on her cell phone and looked very surprised when 2 men walked into the kitchen. She quickly turned off the phone without saying a word to her interlocutor. "You're back. I thought you were done here." Peter Nesbitt stepped aside so that his partner had an equal opportunity to observe Lisa Evans. "We thought we were done here, too. However, the technicians found what appeared to be marks on the gas and brake pedals in your car. We're taking your car to the site for a thorough inspection. I hope you don't mind." The 2 detectives watched her closely as he replied, "That's a question we'll probably need an answer to. We have no way of knowing at this point. Is this related to the incident at the park? But if it turns out to be a coincidence found there, rest assured we will press for answers. Oh, and we'll need the shoes you wore today." "I haven't been anywhere near the park. I haven't been there in weeks. I don't understand." As she spoke, she took off her shoes and handed them to Detective Nesbitt. When this was done, she fell into a chair, covered her face with her hands, and began to sob. The 2 detectives, realizing they couldn't say or do more without more information, said goodbye to her, leaving her in the same position, slumped in the kitchen chair. "What do you think, Dave? Is she what she seems to be? A wife, distraught with worry about her husband? Or maybe she's just a very good actress. Did you notice that she was on the phone when we came in and had disconnected the other person?" David Klein shook his head and said, "I just don't know, Pete. I just don't know. She seems sincere enough, but you know how it goes. If the evidence in his car turns out to be his, there's a good chance his wife is involved. We see this over and over again. Maybe we should do a few checks around them. Someone might know something that's relevant to this whole thing. And as for the phone conversation, maybe. She was talking to her best friend. Women always turn to their best friend when something goes wrong." "Yeah, I think you're right. A little old-fashioned digging might lead to something. What I'd really like to know is why he arrived in town 2 days earlier than expected. That could be the key to the whole case." When he reached his car, Detective Nesbitt took out a plastic evidence bag, placed a pair of shoes in it, and sealed the bag tightly. Since both partners arrived separately, each had their own car. Driving back to the station, each alone, they tried to piece together a picture from the evidence they had. Unfortunately, neither of them had enough data to come to anything more definitive than what they had already discussed. Both were busy filling out reports and other paperwork for the rest of their shift. There was no new information from the lab before they went home, so they could only process what they had already learned that day. The next morning, both Peter and Dave arrived half an hour early. It was clear that the Mark Evans case was at the forefront of both of their minds. Fortunately, their dedication to work was rewarded. A stack of reports from the forensic lab and the medical examiner awaited them on the table. They took an hour to read the reports, passing them back and forth as they absorbed the information presented. When they finished what they had already completed, they realized that there were still many further reports to be received. Looking at one particular report, Peter Nesbitt said to his partner, "This data certainly points in one direction, doesn't it? It looks like we can expect a few more reports this morning, so I don't think we should rush to conclusions. I'd rather not make hasty decisions." David Klein nodded his head as his partner spoke and replied, "I think you're right. Let's wait until they get more data out of the computer. In the meantime, we can go and talk to his lawyer and some of the people he worked with. I'm not sure we have enough to make an arrest yet. We'll need to take official statements before going to the DA." The two detectives were in complete agreement and left around 9 a.m. for the office of attorney Mark Evans. Like everyone in the legal community, Robert Graham did not want to appear biased against the police, especially during the investigation. He quickly gave them a few minutes of his time. "Do you understand that I cannot discuss anything pertaining to my client's legal situation? Having said that, let's hear what you want from me so that I can decide whether to answer your questions or not." The lawyer sat back in his chair and waited expectantly. Detective Nesbitt spoke quickly, not wanting to waste too much of the lawyer's precious time. "We have several email messages that we received under a warrant from Mark Evans' computer. Can you confirm receipt of them for us? We just need to know that the messages were actually sent to you in the last couple of weeks. We want to be sure that these aren't just drafts." He handed 4 sheets of paper to the lawyer, who quickly scanned each one before replying, "These letters appear to be genuine. I can confirm receipt of them." He handed them back to the detective, who immediately stood up and said, "Thank you, Mr. Graham. That's all we need. We couldn't make investigative decisions based on these letters without confirming their authenticity." The two detectives left the office, exchanging smiles as they headed back to the car. Driving to ABC Industrial, Peter Nesbitt said to his partner, "As you said yesterday, in these situations, there is usually a spouse involved. We still have a few steps to go through." When they arrived at Mark Evans' place of work, they were quickly ushered into the office of his immediate superior. This time, it was Detective Klein who spoke. "We are investigating the discovery of a car in George Washington Park yesterday. You probably read about it in this morning's paper. The car belonged to one of your employees, Mark Evans. We have a few questions that you may be able to answer." Mark's boss quickly assured them that he would do everything he could to help them. He said that Mark was considered a very valuable employee, and anything that could be done to solve this mystery was definitely acceptable. "First, I would like to know if Mark was expected to remain in Pittsburgh after Friday night. There are reports that he was scheduled to attend seminars throughout Saturday and Sunday. We need to know if that is the case." His boss quickly responded, "Mark was definitely not scheduled for the weekend. I fully expected him to be back Friday night." Detective Klein nodded, made a note on his notepad, and continued, "Have you noticed anything unusual in Mark's behavior lately? We want to see if there was something on his mind, something that caught his eye." The man at the desk thought for a moment and then replied, "Mark has actually seemed more stressed lately. A couple of weeks ago, I asked him if there was a problem. He then said that everything was fine. I also noticed that he often seemed submerged. I just assumed he was working hard to solve our problems, but I guess he might have other things on his mind." The detectives thanked him and then quickly headed back to their car. The situation was becoming clearer, and both knew that by the end of the day, they would likely have a major breakthrough in this matter. Late in the morning, they returned to the office to find that some preliminary DNA results had arrived. There was also a strange box with wires lying on the report from the forensic laboratory. The two detectives found it particularly interesting, especially when combined with some of the printed maps the computer technician had given them. Another empty space was filled, and the picture became clearer. The two men took their accumulated data, printouts, and notebooks with them as they went to spend a couple of hours in one of the empty interrogation rooms. By the time they left, they had a clear idea of what had happened in the park, although there were still large gaps. They agreed that it was time to visit Lisa Evans again. This time, they had enough information to ask her a few questions, tough questions. Depending on her answers, there could be a reason to bring her in for an official statement. Detectives arrived at the Evans home a little after 3 in the afternoon. They didn't call ahead so as not to give her a chance to prepare for their arrival. They really wanted to take her by surprise. They walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell like regular visitors. Lisa Evans was clearly surprised to see two men on the doorstep. "Detectives, have you found my husband? I call dispatch every couple of hours, and they keep telling me there's no news." Detective Nesbitt responded, "No, we haven't found your husband yet, but we've made some progress. We'd like to come in and ask you a few questions, if that's okay." Lisa Evans seemed a little confused, but then backed down and said, "Sure, come in. I'll do anything to help you find Mark." She walked into the living room, two men following her. Sitting down on the sofa, each of the detectives took a chair opposite. Detective Klein began the conversation by opening a notepad and asking, "Is there anything you want to tell us about your relationship with Blake Moore?" Detectives decided that such a direct question could be a way to unsettle Lisa Evans so that she would reveal something she would rather hide. The decision was immediately rewarded when Lisa Evans quickly paled before saying, "Wah, what do you mean, my relationship with Blake? He's my husband's best friend. He always hangs out with Mark, but he's just my friend." Her eyes darted back and forth between the two detectives. Now Detective Nesbitt joined the conversation. "Are you or are you not having an affair with Blake Moore?" The detective asked the question in a calm, even tone, and now waited for an answer. It seemed impossible, but both detectives later agreed that she became even paler after the second question. Her mouth opened and closed several times without making a sound before she said, "Absolutely not. How can you come here and ask me such questions?" The two detectives immediately stood up, and Detective Klein said, "I think you'll have to come with us to the station. We'll take an official statement from you." Lisa was clearly starting to panic and said, "What? Am I under arrest? Why should I go to the station with you?" "You are not under arrest. Yet, we have reason to believe that you have not been honest with us, and we want an official statement. You will be able to request a lawyer if you wish." Lisa looked desperately from one detective to another and quickly said, "I don't need a lawyer. I haven't done anything. If you want me to come to the station to answer your questions, then fine, I'll do it. I'll do anything to help you. Find my Mark." Lisa Evans quickly stood up to accompany the two detectives to the car for the ride downtown. She was walking ahead of them, so she didn't notice when Pete gave Dave the sign of approval. After helping her into the back seat, the two men took their seats in the front and silently drove back to the police station. Arriving at the station, the detectives walked slowly with Lisa Evans up the stairs to their station and then into one of the empty interrogation rooms. They chose the darkest room they could find that needed painting and could use some new furniture. They wanted to create the most negative atmosphere possible. "We'll leave you here for a few minutes while we get our paperwork. Are you sure you don't want to talk to a lawyer?" Detective Nesbitt gave her every opportunity to make this decision, but this time she refused, quickly shaking her head. In these gloomy conditions, she still looked very beautiful, although her blue eyes were full of tears. She sat down heavily in one of the chairs as the detective walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. "Make sure both cameras are running the entire time we're with her. I want a good record of everything said. I have a feeling we're going to solve this case, and I don't want to miss a word of what she says." Detective Klein spoke with his superior, the person who would record and personally testify to what was said in the interview room. Only then did Peter Nesbitt approach with the files they had accumulated. He was thinking about his upcoming interview with Lisa Evans and said, "Let's get some coffee first. Let her worry a little." This was quickly agreed upon, and the three men went to spend the next 20 minutes in the staff room discussing the case and how they would conduct the interrogation. Life doesn't go in a straight line. Countless events occur simultaneously in different time frames. While two detectives were speaking with Mark Evans' manager this morning, across town a volunteer answered a call at the Crime Stoppers office. "Good morning, this is your local Crime Stoppers office. We pay up to $1,000 cash for good tips on unsolved crimes. How can you help us fight crime? Please note that this call is being recorded." No one answered for a few seconds, and the volunteer manning the phone thought there was no one on the line. But just before she was about to hang up, the elderly male interlocutor said, "This is where I am. Can I get money if I help the police?" "Well, sir, it depends on what you tell us, what crime it's about, and how much the police think you helped solve it. Do you have information about the crime?" There was silence again for a few moments before the caller spoke. "So I won't get the money now. Should I wait? What if the cops want to trick me? Then what, huh?" "Well, sir, we need to know for sure that you helped. The money doesn't come from the police, so they have no reason to deceive you, sir. Why don't you tell me what you know, and I'll give you a code number to proceed with. You can call back in a few days, and I will tell you if the information helped and how much it costs." The man said, a little annoyed, "I want the money now. I need money now." "Well, sir, that's how it works. What do you mean when you say you need money? If you are homeless and need food, I can give you the addresses of several shelters that provide food." "I don't need any damn food. I need money. You know, the grape juice that sells for $5 a bottle." The woman giggled to herself, but told the man, "I'm afraid I can't help you with this right now. If your information is useful, you will probably be able to buy many of these bottles of grape juice." "Good, then. I'll wait." What I saw was someone throwing away a weapon into the river. I was under the 3rd Street Bridge, minding my own business on a Sunday morning, or at least I think it was a Sunday morning, when this guy pulled into a public parking lot. When he came out, he was carrying a weapon and 2 shovels. He threw them all into the river right in front of me. I was scared, I'll tell you. I thought that he would definitely notice me and use this weapon on me. The cameraman was a little curious about what the old man would say next, and she asked, "Was that in the parking lot on the east side of the 3rd Street Bridge? Did he throw them far into the water?" "Yes, exactly there, and no, he just threw them off the end of the little pier that is there. These guys shouldn't have any problems finding weapons." He paused before adding, "I can describe it. He was large and had blonde hair. Not blonde, just light, and his car. It was dark blue, and the license plate started with AS, but I forgot the rest. Jimmy brought some juice, and he shared, so I forgot some of it. But the rest is true. I lived in Arizona and once owned a Chevrolet Impala SS. That's why I remembered." The woman wrote down all the information and was now ready to end the call. "Well, sir, I think I have everything I need. I'll give you a number to remember. Number 127. Call back in a few days and say you're calling about tip number 127, and I'll tell you if the information was helpful to the police. We will also be able to find out how much this information is worth and tell you where you can anonymously collect the money." The call ended quickly, and the Crime Stoppers operator relayed the information to the police contact she reported to. He suggested a diver would be sent out soon, as the task of getting guns off the streets was one of the mayor's top priorities. As it turned out, a police diver arrived at the scene just over an hour later and only took a few minutes to find 3 items thrown into the river. The appropriate reports were completed and then submitted to Crime Stoppers. By 2:30 a.m., the shovels were with the property clerk and the guns were taken to the forensic lab for further testing to determine if they matched any unsolved crimes in the city. Once the weapon was registered, it quickly became clear that the caliber and type of casing ammunition still inside it matched perfectly with a recent crime scene in George Washington Park. Within a few minutes, the weapon was thoroughly checked and a test bullet was fired for comparative purposes. It turned out to be a perfect match with a bullet recovered from a log found in the park. The report was immediately sent upstairs to the attention of the detectives in charge of the case, and a technician was dispatched to retrieve 2 shovels from the property clerk. Just as different chains of events can happen in parallel, they can also intersect, and that's exactly what happened when the detectives and their commander left the staff room. They encountered a clerk who was delivering ballistics and Crime Stoppers reports. "Detectives, I was just bringing you this information. We have obtained the weapons used in the George Washington Park shooting. The attached Crime Stoppers report also has some information. It may even lead you straight to the culprit." The smiling forensic lab clerk handed 2 reports to the surprised detectives and returned to his department. Detectives Klein and Nesbitt took turns reviewing the 2 reports. Within seconds, they were sitting side by side in front of a computer terminal, calling up records from the Department of Vehicle Registration. When they finished, they quickly discussed the plan. "Pete, I suggest we split up. If you want, I will begin interrogating our guest in the interrogation room, and you can take a uniformed officer and visit Mr. Moore. We should bring him here for questioning too." "Sounds like a plan, Dave. Everything is going well, isn't it?" New parallel lines of action were formed as Detective Klein took the accumulated reports and information and headed to the interrogation room, where Lisa Evans continued to wait. Meanwhile, his partner discussed with the commanding officer the request for the uniformed officer's assistance for a surprise visit to Blake Moore. Soon he was at the door, waiting for the patrol car that was supposed to meet him at Moore's house. When Detective Klein entered the interrogation room, Lisa Evans sat quietly at the table, her face showing neither sadness nor fear. She seemed calmly awaiting her fate, whatever it might be. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Mrs. Evans. I'm ready to start. Please note that there are 2 video cameras in this room, and everything we say and do is recorded." She looked at him with some surprise and said, "I don't care if you record us. I have nothing to hide." He got down to business. "Okay, let's begin. I'll start where we left off when we talked at your house. One more time, are you having an affair with Blake Moore? Yes or no?" His decision to cut to the chase again had a noticeable effect on her. Her shoulders sagged a little, and she turned away, no longer meeting the detective's gaze. After a few seconds, she quietly said, "Yes." Detective Klein pulled a couple of pages from the stack in front of him. "It's good that you decided to be honest. We have evidence of your affair here, printed from your husband's laptop." Well, it shocked her. She met his eyes again. "What do you mean? Do you have proof? Nobody knew about Blake and me." "Your husband certainly knew, as you can see in these pages. Here is an email he sent to his lawyer almost a month ago in which he says he wants to start preparing the papers for a divorce on grounds of adultery. Here's a map from 2 weeks ago clearly showing the route you took that day, with timestamps showing you spent 2 hours at Blake Moore's house. Here's a copy of the email your husband sent his lawyer that day, telling him how you lied when he called you that day when you said you were home." Sheets of paper slid across the table one after another, each one stopping in front of the seated woman. She looked at the papers and at the detective several times before picking each one up and confirming that they actually showed what the detective said. Finally, she spoke. "How? How could Mark do this? How could he know where I was? This map." She took the detailed map and traced the route that was clearly marked on it, showing the path she took from her home to her lover's home. "I don't know how your husband found out in the first place, but something made him install this device in your car." He picked up a small black device, smaller than a pack of cigarettes, and handed it to her. It had PT 200 stamped on its side and Rocky Mountain tracking below. He bought this online along with the unlimited tracking option and could use his laptop to get a full, real-time location history for you with full addresses and timestamps. He could know where your car was every minute of every day since he installed that under-dash device. She looked at the small, innocent-looking electronic device as if it were a scorpion ready to sting her. Are you saying Mark has known about us for weeks? Oh God, and he wanted a divorce. She began to cry again, and the detective took the moment to return the documents and tracking device, which he had placed in a separate pile next to him. He definitely knew, along with the times and places of all 4 of your meetings with his friend in the last month. The last map was created just after midnight on Saturday night, the night he disappeared. It was around the same time that he sent an email to his lawyer telling him how he was going to go to Moore's house and confront you both. He told his lawyer he was worried he might be arrested if he broke into the house or got into a fight with your lover, his supposed friend. She looked at the detective again and said, "But he never came there. I spent the night there, but Mark never came. Something must have happened to him before he got to Blake's house." The detective was prepared for this statement and quickly said, "I'm sure something happened to him. Preliminary DNA results confirm that the evidence in the park is his, and we just recovered the weapon that was used. We can link the weapon to your lover, and now the question is how long are you going to cover it for?" Blake. Blake never did anything with Mark. I was with him the whole time, and he never left that night. Her eyes left the detective again as she continued, "We were together all night in his bed." The detective pulled a few more pages from his stack and said, "We have more evidence. The evidence in your car and on your shoes, I might add, also belongs to your husband. Right now, my partner is on his way to pick up Mr. Moore, and will soon find out if his story matches yours. There is also the issue of prosecutorial discretion. Whichever of you two is the first to tell what really happened and where we can find your husband's body will get the best offer in the trial." He handed the test reports to her, but she barely looked at them. "Mark is not dead. He can't be dead. I love him. I need him." She began to cry again, and the detective took the reports and tracking device, placing them in a separate pile in front of him and heading towards the door. "I'll leave you for a few minutes so you can come to your senses. You're really not doing yourself any favors by refusing to acknowledge your responsibility in this." Detective Klein left the stack of evidence on his desk, shook his head as he passed his commanding officer, and headed to the break room for a fresh cup of coffee. His commander continued to periodically glance at the monitor, displaying the interior of the interrogation room to ensure that the detained woman remained safe and secure. As he left the station, Detective Nesbitt was deep in thought about the Mark Evans case. It seemed like they had gotten enough information from the forensics department to solve it soon. He also wondered if Blake Moore was still in town. If he had known how much evidence the police already had, he probably would have tried to escape. He arrived at Moore's house almost simultaneously with a patrol car that was supposed to provide him with backup. The 2 officers knew each other and exchanged greetings as they headed to the front door. Detective Nesbitt was almost surprised when their knocking quickly resulted in Blake Moore answering the door. The man looked curiously at the 2 strangers at his door, one clearly wearing a police uniform and the other holding an ID and badge. "Yes, officers. How can I help?" The detective quickly responded, "I'm Detective Nesbitt, and I'm here about the disappearance of Mark Evans. We would like you to join us at the interrogation station. We have Mrs. Evans there now, and some questions have arisen that will require your participation." Tall, strong, and masculinely handsome, the man quickly asked, "Am I being arrested? I know Mark is missing because I spoke to his wife. I don't think I can help you. We have a few questions that we think you might be able to answer. If you don't mind, we would like you to accompany us now, although you are not under arrest." Blake Moore seemed too shocked to offer any real resistance to their request and quickly joined them on their way to the unmarked car driven by Detective Nesbitt. Once there, he calmly accepted their invitation to sit in the back seat and was not at all surprised that the detective and the uniformed officer sat in the front seats. Department protocol required 2 officers to provide backup when dealing with a potentially dangerous suspect. The detective first addressed his uniformed partner. "We'll send one of the patrol cars later to take you back to your patrol car." After completing this formality, Detective Nesbitt turned to Blake Moore. "Tell me, Mr. Moore, how well do you know Mrs. Evans?" Their passenger quickly responded, "She's just Mark's wife to me. I've known her since he met her. Why are you asking?" "Just wondering, sir. What are you doing, Mr. Moore?" Blake Moore seemed to relax a little at this question and answered, "I own a small landscaping company, Moore's Landscaping. We work a lot with commercial properties. You have probably seen some of our work, as we have even done work for the city." Their conversation continued until they arrived at the police station, where Blake Moore was taken to an interrogation room next to the one where Lisa Evans was being held. He, too, was asked to wait alone while the detective collected documents that had been placed on his desk shortly before by Detective Klein. A few minutes later, a conversation began between Blake Moore and Detective Nesbitt, which was very reminiscent of the recently concluded interrogation of Lisa Evans. He initially denied having an affair with Lisa Evans, but emails and tracking reports quickly caused him to change his story. He quickly admitted that they had an affair that lasted almost 4 months. He vehemently denied they did anything to Mark Evans and insisted neither he nor Lisa left his house the night Lisa's husband disappeared. As Detective Nesbitt continued to ask questions regarding his suspect's steadfast denials of any involvement in the disappearance of Mark Evans, a new theory was put forward about what happened in the park. "I had nothing to do with what happened in that park. If Mark found out about Lisa and me, he would probably explode, and there is no guarantee what he would do. He may even have hired and paid his own killer to frame Lisa and me. He and I had problems because of my attitude towards Lisa." "What do you mean, Mr. Moore?" "We have the weapon that was used. The witness described you and your car and stated that you were responsible for throwing the weapon into the river. He even gave away most of your license plate number. Don't try to make up the story that Mark Evans staged an elaborate suicide to frame you and his wife." Blake Moore became very agitated and responded, "You don't know Mark. We've been best friends since elementary school, but I've known for years that it's better not to be seen hanging out with his girlfriends or now his wife. We were in high school when I did this one day. I was dating one of his girlfriends behind his back, and when he found out later that I slept with her while they were dating, he got so angry that he scared me. I'm much bigger than him and have always been stronger, but he scared me. He then warned me that he would not tolerate this anymore and that I would be a dead man." The detective listened with faint amusement on his face. "Are you saying that you were really afraid of what he would do if he found out, but you still dated his wife? Man, this doesn't make sense." Blake was more calm when he said, "It's stupid, isn't it? I just couldn't resist her. It's been slowly building up between us for years, and I finally took the serious step a few months ago. We have met periodically since then. I have no idea how he would find out. We were so careful." The detective went through his reports before continuing, "Yeah, that was stupid. Sometimes I think that half of our murders and suicides are due to such stupidity. The old eternal triangle. The only thing in this case, I think, is that we have you and Lisa as the culprits. You can also tell us what happened. Did he take you by surprise and the situation got out of control? Or maybe you two planned this from the beginning so you could be together and not have to worry about whether he would find out or not. I don't buy the idea that he arranged his own murder. It's too weird. He had already negotiated a divorce with his lawyer, so why would he suddenly resort to this? I don't know what happened. I just know that Lisa and I have nothing to do with this. As for being together, that was not the plan. We both knew it was just a fling and it wouldn't last much longer. We have already begun to lose interest in this." Detective Nesbitt leaned forward before saying, "We have probable cause to search your home, car, and office. I wouldn't be surprised if this is already happening. You better tell the truth before we put the final nail in your coffin. I will offer you the same thing that I am sure your lover has already received from my partner. Be the first to tell what happened and get a reduced sentence. There is no point in both being silent and getting the maximum. Use your head and do yourself a favor." Blake Moore was outraged. "I had nothing to do with what happened to Mark. Perhaps Lisa arranged something herself, but if so, I don't know anything. The detective collected his papers without responding to the suspect's latest theory. As he left the room, he said, "That's what happens. When we have two criminals working together, one always tries to pin the blame on the other. You can relax for a while because I don't think you'll be released anytime soon." After leaving the interview room, Detective Nesbitt found his partner waiting for him with another report in his hands. "Everything is getting better and better. Two shovels found in the river are labeled as belonging to Moore's Landscaping. What a fool! Why do these guys always think we'll never figure out what happened?" A few minutes later, two detectives were explaining the evidence they had collected to the district attorney. Even though they didn't have a body and the evidence was circumstantial, it didn't take long to convince him that there was enough evidence to press charges. Half an hour later, Lisa Evans and Blake Moore were charged with the murder of Mark Evans. Both loudly protested their innocence as they were read their Miranda rights, but were told the case was now in the hands of prosecutors and the court system. Neither of them was comforted by this information. After the charges were filed, Lisa and Blake were taken to the ground floor of the police station to be fingerprinted and photographed with arrest numbers. The instruction not to smile for the photos was completely unnecessary, since Blake always showed an angry expression on his face, and Lisa could not cry and smile at the same time. As they were returned to adjacent cells, they had their first opportunity to speak to each other since the charges were laid. "What are we going to do, Blake? They can't believe we did something to Mark, can they?" Lisa still sobbed periodically, but had mostly stopped. "We need to find lawyers, I think, unless you want to share a lawyer with me. It might be cheaper, and since we're being accused of the same thing, it makes sense. This whole situation is completely wrong. I'm sure Mark arranged it for us. I think the bastard might have paid someone to kill him and then left a trail so the cops would blame us." Mark was clearly still very angry. "Do you really think he would do that?" Lisa was outraged by the proposal. "Why would Mark go to such extreme measures to kill himself?" "I don't think you knew your husband as well as you thought you did, Lisa. I'm completely surprised that he didn't do something drastic the day he found out about us. This is a real mystery to me. I've known Mark for years, and I didn't think he'd just let it go. If I had thought for even a second that he would find out about us, I would never have touched you for anything in the world." He then told her what happened years ago when he went behind Mark's back to his girlfriend. They were now in their cells, separated by a 6-inch thick concrete wall, but could easily and freely talk to each other while standing at the bars next to the concrete wall. "I don't believe Mark is capable of something like that. I don't know how or when he found out. I never noticed him treating me differently. He was out of town most of the times we met, and we were never together in public. The couple of times we met while he was in town were those times when we were at a little motel on the north side of town," Lisa replied. After some thought, she continued, "I shouldn't have betrayed him. Even if he's not dead, he'll still want a divorce." During the last sentence, her voice broke several times. Apparently, she began to worry again. Blake managed a few sobs before he said, "Damn it, Lisa. Give it some rest. You should have realized how it would end if he caught us. Your eyes were open the first time you came to my house and found yourself in my bed." His words had the desired effect, and she stopped sobbing. After a few seconds, she said quietly, "You're right. I can only hope that he will forgive me." They were both silent for a few minutes before Lisa suggested, "I could call Robert Graham, I guess. He was our lawyer, and if he agreed to represent us both, we could just split the costs." They agreed to this proposal on legal grounds, and after a few minutes, when she managed to attract the attention of a passing officer, she was taken to a small room intended for making calls, where there was a telephone and a phone book. Her call to Robert Graham was not as easy as she expected, as he informed her that, as Mark's divorce lawyer, he could not represent her. He suggested that one of his colleagues, Basil Smith, a lawyer with extensive experience in criminal matters, take on their case. She quickly agreed, and it was agreed that their new lawyer would arrive immediately to discuss the case. Blake was glad to hear that the lawyer was on the way and thanked her for calling. They both returned to the wooden benches bolted to the back wall of their cells and spent the next hour in their thoughts as they waited. When Basil Smith arrived, they were both ushered into a small room reserved for lawyer-client meetings. Basil Smith was the embodiment of the lawyer's idea. He was short, stocky, with thin dark hair framing the bald spot on his head. At least he didn't resort to the horrible combing. A dark blue striped suit completed the look of this professional at the age of about 50. The introduction was quick, and the two nervous clients waited while he studied the copies of the indictment documents that were handed to him upon arrival. After completing this task, he raised his head and said, "So, you are both accused of the murder of Mark Evans. What can you say about what the arresting officers told you? You're the first, Mrs. Evans. Briefly, please. I just want to get a general idea of what we have." Lisa gave a summary of what had happened since Detective Nesbitt met her in the yard on Sunday afternoon. By the time she was talking about fingerprinting and taking photographs, she was crying again. Between sobs, she concluded her statement by saying, "I had nothing to do with what happened in the park. I love Mark. I couldn't hurt him." Basil Smith digested her words for a minute before he turned to Blake and said, "Now it's your turn," without unnecessary details. Blake more quickly laid out what happened from the moment officers arrived at his home that afternoon, and he was far from crying as he told the story. He concluded his speech by saying, "Lisa and I had nothing to do with Mark's disappearance or what happened at the park. I told Lisa and the cops the same thing, and now I'll tell you. Mark Evans set it up. I believe he paid for his death, and part of the deal was to blame us." He looked at the lawyer carefully, as if challenging him to disagree with his explanation. Blake's repetition of his belief that Mark was dead brought tears to Lisa's eyes again. Their lawyer looked at her briefly, then said, "Now is not the time to convince each other. Your first priority will be your collateral. Based on what you've told me and these charging documents, I expect bail to be around $100,000 for each of you. Will there be problems with bail?" Lisa looked stunned and asked, "Do I need $100,000 for bail?" She was ready to panic, knowing that she did not have such funds. "No, no, Lisa. You only need 10% or $10,000 cash to cover the $100,000 deposit. In this state, full bail is not required unless the judge orders otherwise," the lawyer quickly explained. After this explanation, neither of them had any difficulty in obtaining bail, and naturally they wondered whether they could be released immediately. "Tomorrow morning you will be charged and bail will be set. Then you can complete the necessary documents to exit. You'll spend the night here tonight, so accept it," the lawyer said. Both clients reacted negatively to this statement. Their lawyer said there was nothing he could do until they were arrested. Once the task of freeing them is completed, he will speak with the district attorney to obtain disclosure of the evidence. He'll better understand what they're up against when he knows what they have in the form of actual evidence. They were returned to cells where none of them slept much. Everyone got greasy takeout for dinner, one blanket for the night, and noisy cellmates in the middle of the night. They didn't look particularly fresh the next morning when they met with their lawyer at 10 a.m., shortly before their first court appearance. None of the court personnel, not even the judge, cared about their appearance when accepting their pleas of innocence and setting bail at the expected $100,000. Because Blake had both his home and business as assets, he was able to quickly post $10,000 bail and was released by early afternoon. Lisa, however, was not so lucky. Unlike Blake, she did not have exclusive ownership of the house, so this option was eliminated. Then she was shocked to discover that her savings account, which she had expected to have more than $20,000 in, was empty. Without this, she was unable to raise the necessary funds and ended up calling her parents in desperation. Explaining the need for bail to her parents turned out to be one of the most difficult tasks of her life. Only after much persuasion did they finally agree to cover her $10,000 shortfall. By the time Lisa enlisted her parents' help, it was too late to complete the paperwork, and she spent a second night in the cell, this time with two slightly high, easily accessible girls. She spent most of the night huddled in a corner under her only blanket. By noon the next day, with all the financial paperwork completed, she was finally allowed to leave the station and return to the empty house. She immediately took a shower, went to bed, and ignored several calls, letting the answering machine handle them. The next month passed rather quickly for the two defendants. Within the first few days, Lisa learned that the money withdrawn from her joint account with her husband had been withdrawn by him approximately 10 days before his disappearance. Her lawyer discovered that a letter had been sent to his partner, Robert Graham, in which Mark explained that he was withdrawing funds from the account in cash so that his wife could not deprive him of his legal share when she received divorce papers. It was not stated what he did with the cash, although the letter stated that he would return her share after reaching an appropriate agreement with Lisa under the terms of the divorce. Lisa and Blake met several times with Basil Smith, who informed them that he had met with the district attorney, received copies of various reports and summaries of evidence, and planned to meet with the district attorney in the hope that all charges would be dropped. He felt that the absence of a body or a witness to question would make it impossible to convict them. Shortly after they were released on bail, at their first meeting, he suggested hiring a private investigator to try to prove that Mark had somehow contributed to his death or disappearance. Blake was happy about the offer, although Lisa still didn't believe Mark would do something like that. She developed a theory that Mark was the victim of a botched carjacking. She said it was no less logical than Blake's theory. Even with her theory about the hijacking, she still didn't want to admit that everything pointed to Mark no longer being alive. Over the next few weeks, they received regular reports from the hired detective, but they were all the same. He found nothing. Basil Smith also suggested that the detective try to find the old tramp who reported the disposal of weapons and shovels. Basil obtained a copy of the call recording from Crime Stoppers, and the detective used it to canvass areas where homeless people commonly lived. No one he spoke to recognized the voice. It also seemed strange that the informant never called to see if tip number 127 had provided him with juice for a while. It was necessary to accept the possibility that the caller simply forgot the number or even forgot that he called. This population was also highly mobile, moving from one area to another depending on factors such as weather, police presence, and the availability of sources of quick income. Although he said nothing about it, Basil Smith began to notice that his two clients were no longer getting along with each other. Neither of them volunteered information, but shortly after they were released on bail, Blake suggested to Lisa that now that Mark was out of the game, they could meet as much as they wanted at either of their homes. Her response was quick and categorical. "I want nothing to do with you except our business." You continued to insist, and like a fool, I gave in. Now I've lost Mark. Her answer ended with another attack of tears, which seemed to be repeated often for almost no reason. Blake's response was laconic and final. "Do as you please, Lisa. You're not the only woman in town." Since then, they have not spoken to each other, except in the presence of their lawyer, where a showdown could harm both of them. The ashes of their forbidden love have cooled. A little over a month later, Basil Smith arranged a meeting with District Attorney Jeff Bugden that they could all attend. Lisa and Blake entered the meeting hoping the charges would be dropped. They were constantly pestered by jokers on the phone and asked by friends and acquaintances about the nature of their relationship. Both began checking calls using caller ID and an answering machine. Dropping the charges would allow them to return to normal life. Lisa and Blake were surprised at how young, stylish, and informal Jeff Bugden looked. He could have been their lawyer's son, except he had full hair. The prosecutor spoke as soon as all four sat down. "I'm glad we were able to meet so quickly. Today I received the final reports from the medical examiner, and the police and forensic reports are now fully complete. I have carefully reviewed all the evidence and believe that the best service to the public would be to offer you a reduced sentence of 8 to 12 years in exchange for a guilty plea to second-degree murder." The shock and horror reflected on the faces of the accused, and to some extent on the face of their lawyer, was noticeable. Lisa and Blake protested loudly, declaring their innocence, while their lawyer tried to calm them down and asked the prosecutor questions about how he could justify such a proposal. As the other side of the table calmed down, Jeff Bugden continued, "Since the initial charges were filed, I have received new reports and information. I will immediately forward copies of this new information to Mr. Smith. The first is a DNA report on evidence samples taken from the back of the license plate and the rubber trunk seal of your car, Mr. Moore. Both samples contain DNA from Mark Evans. The samples were taken under a search warrant prior to your release on bail. Also, the piece of black polyethylene found under the rear wheel of Mark Evans' car matches the brand and style used in your landscaping business." The prosecutor stopped speaking at this point, choosing to observe the defendant's reactions. Lisa looked more angry than shocked. While Blake was still digesting the implications of the facts presented by the prosecutor, Lisa suddenly said, "Blake, what did you do?" She seemed ready to continue her accusations, but Basil Smith immediately insisted on her silence. Blake instantly exploded at her accusation. "You know I had nothing to do with this. You were with me in my bed when it happened." That was all he had time to say before Basil grabbed him by the arm and told him to be quiet in a categorical manner. The lawyer's next words were addressed to the prosecutor. "Please excuse my clients, Jeff. We came here with the hope that the charges would be dropped, and your announcement took them by surprise." The prosecutor stood up, pulled a folder of reports from his briefcase, handed them to Basil Smith, and quickly left the room. As the door closed behind the departing prosecutor, Lisa and Blake began talking to the lawyer again at the same time. He couldn't make out what they were both saying and had to order them to be quiet. Hearing their own lawyer tell them to shut up, they were so shocked that they complied. "I know you are both shocked and upset by this turn of events. I didn't expect this either. There is no point in arguing with each other over this situation. We need to figure out how we're going to handle this without both of you ending up in jail. I understand that you both want to refuse his offer of 8 to 20 years in prison." Both clients quickly and categorically rejected the deal as proposed. They both believed that it would be impossible to convict them at trial. When it was decided that he would refuse the offer on their behalf, Basil Smith dismissed them, saying that he would have a lot of work to do preparing for the trial. When his two clients left, Basil was left alone in the room and quickly scanned the new reports and wondered if his clients were telling the truth. Technically, it didn't matter. He protected them, regardless of the state of their souls. He just liked it when he was confident in what his clients were saying. Several months passed, and the trial of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore was about to begin. At 10 a.m. Monday, as everyone in the courtroom stood, Judge Robert Cox took his seat. The defense table was set up so that Basil Smith sat between his two clients. He decided that this was the best way to deal with the fact that they could barely be polite to each other. He considered suggesting that they each hire their own lawyer to keep them separate, but realized that they probably wouldn't be able to pay for a lawyer individually. He knew that Blake Moore's business was in decline, and Lisa Evans had recently quit her job due to the stress of a pending trial and difficulty communicating with her estranged husband's friends and acquaintances. District Attorney Jeff Bugden's public statements were the first significant development, and he immediately went to the point. "Dear jurors, I will tell you the truth right away. We don't have the body of the victim in this case, Mark Evans. However, we intend to show you that he is dead and that the two accused are undoubtedly guilty of his murder." He started slowly, saying the two accused began an affair several months ago. At some point, Mark Evans learned of the situation and began divorce proceedings against his unfaithful wife. Some things remained unknown, such as how and when exactly Mark Evans became suspicious. He described how traces found on Mark Evans' computer would prove he knew when and where the two accused met. Emails will be presented documenting his progress in tracking down the two defendants, preparing his finances in anticipation of the divorce, and finally a message demonstrating his intent to confront the two defendants. He continued, "We cannot show exactly when the three participants in this triangle physically met, but we know what the results were and can show you through photographs and investigative reports what happened. We believe that a meeting took place between the three of them, probably at Mr. Moore's house, and in that meeting Mr. Evans was neutralized." He was then driven, seated in the passenger seat and apparently unconscious, to a remote part of George Washington Park, less than half a mile from Mr. Moore's home. At this point, Lisa Evans lost her composure, and it was only after several warnings from Judge Cox that the lawyer was finally able to calm his client down so that the prosecutor could continue his plea. Through precise investigative techniques and precise forensic tests, it can be proven that both defendants were at the scene of the crime. The defense will say that the two lovers were not at the scene of this terrible crime. How will they prove this? Of course, with the help of their own testimony. Each will claim that the other was with him at the time of the murder, and therefore could not have been involved. This interesting testimony should not, I am sure, distract you, the jury, from returning a guilty verdict. This was a difficult statement for Basil Smith. He tried to rebut this by emphasizing that the accused are innocent until proven guilty, and that such evidence would not be available in such a circumstantial case. He asked jurors to ignore the prosecutor's opening statement and instead rely on the evidence that will be presented at trial. It was a daring effort, but several seasoned court reporters from local newspapers gave the district attorney the win in the first round. The first witness was a department computer expert who described finding emails and maps illustrating the route Mrs. Evans took when she met her lover. The method Mark Evans used was described in one of his emails to a lawyer, and a computer expert explained to the jury how a small electronic device could accurately track the defendant's car and then allow her husband to recreate an accurate map with times and locations on his computer, showing where and when she met her lover. One of the reporters took careful notes, planning to include the name Rocky Mountain Tracking in his article. He was confident that more than one husband or wife would test the company's product based on Mr. Evans' successful use of it. During this testimony, Blake Moore appeared slightly bored, while Lisa Evans appeared very embarrassed and did not look at the jury. There was no point in cross-examining this witness for Basil Smith. The tracking device was what it was, and the emails could be quickly confirmed by his own law firm partner, Robert Graham. After a long lunch break, the trial resumed in the afternoon with testimony from the 911 operator and two patrol officers who responded to the original call. They were simply establishing the basic facts regarding the discovery of Mark Evans' car, and their testimony was relatively drama-free. That changed when detectives involved in the crime scene, following a report from patrol officers, began their testimony. The description of the site, as presented by the district attorney, was now given by forensic scientists and medical examiners present at the scene. When he said this proved the victim was dying, Lisa Evans lost her composure again. She screamed, "No, Mark can't be dead." Lisa burst into tears, and when it became obvious that she would not be able to calm down, the judge called a break. The court hearing was adjourned until 10 a.m. the next day. The second day of the trial began the same way as the first, at exactly 10 a.m. The medical examiner again took the witness stand, but added little that was new. It mainly expanded information about the tests performed on blood samples. After 15 minutes, the prosecutor, District Attorney Jeff Bugden, finished questioning him, and the witness was turned over to the defense attorney. As Basil Smith stood up and took a few steps towards the witness stand, he quickly looked around to make sure that his client, Lisa Evans, was in control and was not about to disrupt the court again as she had the day before. He knew that she had been prescribed something sedative, but was still afraid that she might interfere with the cross-examination of the witness. He was glad to see that she was sitting quietly in her seat for now. The next witness was one of the forensic experts, specializing in weapons and ammunition. He testified about the bullets recovered, one from a car seat and one from a piece of wood. He testified that the ammunition was of the full metal jacket type and was often used for target shooting and was standard for military applications. The bullet removed from the seat hit the metal seat support and was badly deformed, but the second one removed from the wood was in very good condition. Combining it with the weapon recovered from the river was very easy to do. The parade of witnesses from the crime lab and detectives from the police department continued throughout the morning and part of the afternoon session. Basil Smith's only serious cross-examination came when one of the technicians was describing the recovery of evidence samples from Blake Moore's car. The technician testified that he found evidence behind the license plate, as well as a stain on the foam seal of the trunk. The question quickly followed, could this evidence have been manipulated by a third party? The technician was forced to admit that it was possible, and Basil Smith returned to the defense table with a smile on his face. You situation with a C complication, they indicate that you have given Fromm the latest technique. Then visit the house of Fox Evans. Evidentia was found inside her char and several more US later, the foundation at the bottom of her right so. It would be difficult to assume that this is a setup. He came to the technique, then admitted that it was impossible, then he determined the was, then he transferred the was from you show, then the gas, the pedal, or the vice versa. The defense attorney hoped that the slight doubt created by this apparent confession would allow the jury to discount this evidence against Lisa Evans. As the line of prosecution witnesses drew to a close, the conclusion of the last witness testimony coincided with the end of the day's court hearing. As a result, the third day began with an opportunity for the defense to present its evidence. Local newspapers continued to publish stories in the evening with juicy stories about previous trials involving lovers and exciting stories based on courtroom rumors. Several serious articles about the trial suggested that the writers believed it would be very difficult for the defense to counter the abundance of incriminating evidence presented by the prosecution. They also suggested that the absence of a body could make it difficult to reach a verdict, especially with the defense's expected strategy to question whether Mark Evans is truly dead. From several instances of cross-examination of prosecution witnesses, it is clear that this was Basil Smith's intention. Smith called a recognized evidence expert as his first defense witness. His name was Dr. Wilbur, and he was often hired to provide expert testimony in many trials. He was quickly asked, "What do you think about the testimony of the medical examiner who spoke about the evidence in this case?" Dr. Wilbur put on his glasses and looked at the small notebook he held in his hands. "I believe the collection of evidence could have been done much better. If soil samples had been properly analyzed, a much more accurate estimate of the total quantity at the scene could have been made." The lawyer continued, "Based on your review of the evidence collected, do you have an opinion about the actual numbers at the scene?" "I believe it is quite possible that just a pint and a half could have created the picture as recorded." The final question was, "Do you think that the person who lost the blood shown in the photographs could have survived?" Dr. Wilbur's one-word answer was, "Yes." There was no cross-examination by the district attorney. When Dr. Wilbur was released, Basil Smith moved on to Blake Moore's testimony. Blake calmly and directly stated that he was not guilty of the murder of Mark Evans and personally believed that Mark himself had arranged his murder. He also testified that he never owned a gun and that the shovels found in the river could easily have been stolen from one of his company's work sites. Basil Smith wanted to keep the testimony simple and quickly handed his first witness over to the prosecutor for cross-examination. Jeff Bugden's first question was, "Why do you think Mark Evans was the kind of person who would arrange his own murder?" Blake Moore immediately told the story of Mark's reaction in high school when Blake started dating Mark's girlfriend behind his back. He described how Mark threatened to kill him and said it demonstrated his propensity for violence. The prosecutor considered this for a few moments and then asked, "So, Mr. Moore, this is not the first time you have entered into an illicit relationship with a woman who Mark Evans would consider immune from sexual advances from his best friend. Don't you think that if he was going to kill someone, he would choose you?" Blake Moore couldn't answer directly, but began to flaunt that he had a physical advantage over Mark, and that this would deter his former friend from directly attacking him. "So you think you could physically intimidate your best friend to the point of committing suicide by someone else's hands? Did that make you comfortable about getting his wife? Are your actions the actions of your supposed best friend? You don't need to answer questions, sir. I think it is clear to everyone that your actions and assumptions are those of a narcissistic womanizer who believes that every woman belongs to him and friendship does not matter." Basil quickly objected on the grounds that the district attorney himself was testifying and not simply asking questions. The judge agreed and asked the jury to disregard the prosecution's last statement. However, even this warning did not counteract the correctness of the district attorney's statement. Blake was clearly upset by his treatment by the prosecutor, but left the stand without saying anything more. Basil Smith knew his witness's testimony had not worked as planned, but hoped that the testimony of Mark Evans' wife would turn the tide in their favor. Blake's testimony and the prosecutor's unanswered questions painted Blake in a very bad light to the jury. We hope that this did not affect their opinion of Lisa. Lisa Evans seemed to have her emotions well under control this morning as she took the witness stand. Her lawyer asked her almost the same questions he asked Blake. She categorically stated that she did not participate in the attack on her husband. She explicitly stated that she loved her husband and would never participate in an attempt to physically harm him. When asked to come up with a theory about what might have happened to it, she suggested it might have been stolen. Basil Smith again decided not to ask his witness any further questions. When the prosecutor began asking his questions of Lisa, he began by asking, "Can you explain where you were from midnight Saturday, the time of your husband's last electronic transmission, until 2 p.m. on Sunday?" Lisa was embarrassed by the question and replied, "I told Mr. Smith where I was. I was at Blake Moore's house from 8 p.m. on Saturday until about 1:30 p.m. on Sunday." "You didn't quite answer the question, did you? I'd like you to give us a timeline of what you did from midnight Saturday until you returned home on Sunday." Lisa was confused and discouraged. Finally, she said, "Well, at midnight I was in Blake's bedroom and well, we had sex." She was forced to finish her sentence as the prosecutor continued to motion for her to continue at each of her pauses. "How long did it last? Let me put it this way." He stood waiting for her answer. "Well, we finally fell asleep at 1 in the morning. It might have been a little after 1 o'clock." Lisa was again very embarrassed as she answered, "So from midnight until about 1 you had sex and then fell asleep. What then? Please continue with your chronology." "Well, we slept until about 5:45, I think. I remember getting up to go to the bathroom." The prosecutor asked, "Was Mr. Moore in bed when you woke up? Please continue." "Yes, he was there. We, had sex again and went back to bed around 6:30 and then got up around 11 in the morning." Her answer started out slow, but the words came out faster as she spoke, as she clearly wanted to finish her statement quickly. "So when you returned from the bathroom, Mr. Moore initiated sex with you, and this continued until about 6:30 am, at which point you fell back to sleep. This is true. Is this what happened?" Lisa was very embarrassed when she said, "No, that's not entirely true. He was not cheerful when I returned to bed. I woke him up." The prosecutor was clearly surprised by her answer, but quickly recovered, asking, "You woke him up? What did you do? Shake his shoulder to ask if he wanted to have sex?" Lisa was really embarrassed when she said, "No, I didn't wake him up like that. I started satisfying him until he was ready, and then I woke him up." It seemed like she could barely speak the words as she gave this answer. The prosecutor knew he was getting his way with the jury, as the four women were clearly outraged by her answers so far. He decided to continue this line of questioning. "Please tell us how you woke him up if you didn't shake him by the shoulder and sex didn't wake him up." Lisa seemed resigned to having to continue answering, especially after her lawyer's objections were overruled by Judge Cox. "I just started having sex with him. Then he woke up." She turned very red and turned away from the jury, which was the opposite of what her lawyer had suggested. He asked them both to look the jury in the eyes so they could see their sincerity when they spoke. Jeff Bugden was ready for the final blow. "You told your lawyer earlier that you loved your husband. This is true." He expected an energetic yes from Lisa, an answer accompanied by an energetic nod of the head. He continued, "I'm a little confused. You tell us how much you love your husband, but you have just described how you spent the night he died. You spent the night in his best friend's bed, having sex, initiating sex, and acting like a woman who doesn't care about her husband. How can we believe that you were not involved in his murder?" He stood there waiting for a few moments, but it was obvious that Lisa had no intention of answering his last question. She cried quietly, covering her face with her hands. It was Judge Cox who finally put an end to her misery by asking if anyone had any more questions for the defendant or repeated questions from the defense. When both said no, the judge announced that the trial would adjourn for lunch. The courtroom was nearly empty when Lisa finally regained enough composure to leave the witness stand and join her lawyer and her co-defendant. The three of them went to a very somber dinner, during which an experienced lawyer warned them that the case could now go either way. In private, he felt a little more pessimistic, as both of his clients had failed miserably on the witness stand. The afternoon court session ended quickly as Basil Smith announced that the defense had no more witnesses. Both lawyers were prepared for their closing statements, and there was nothing unexpected in them. The prosecutor told the jury that there was too much to explain for the defendant's innocence. Defense counsel emphasized the circumstantial nature of the case, the lack of a body, the possibility that Mark was still alive, and the lack of a real motive for Mark's murder. The case was presented to the jury by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they deliberated for 2 hours before retiring for the night. The next morning, Lisa and Blake joined Basil Smith in his office, awaiting the call that the jury would return with a verdict. While his two clients waited in one of the conference rooms, Basil Smith was busy with other matters. He warned them that it might take some time before they heard from the court, and he was right. While they were forced to share a conference room, Lisa and Blake put their differences aside and discussed their chances of acquittal. Both were still hopeful and could not accept that the jury would believe they were capable of murder. Finally, at 3:30 p.m., the call came in. The jury had reached a verdict. Lisa's parents came to town for the trial, although they were not present in court when they testified. She was extremely grateful for this, as it meant they didn't hear her confession on the stand. They were in constant contact with the court throughout the day and were informed when news of the verdict arrived. Lisa was grateful for their support as she sat at the defense table next to her lawyer. The reading of the verdict went very quickly. Lisa and Blake were found guilty of second-degree murder. Neither of them could believe it, and Lisa burst into tears again, while Blake slammed his fist on the table in exasperation. Just a couple of minutes later, they were handcuffed and handed over to the custody of the deputies on duty. Lisa only had a few minutes to talk to her parents and declare her innocence. Like normal parents, they joined in her grief. Before the two convicted murderers were led to their cells, they were informed that they would return in a week for sentencing. It was a very bad end to a difficult day. The week between sentencing and sentencing passed quickly. During this time, Lisa's parents visited her daily, and Blake received one visit from a cousin. His parents died, and he was an only child. The week passed very slowly for him, and he soon realized how slowly time could drag when you were in custody. He was also beginning to realize how bad his future looked. Lisa was still in denial and refused to talk about the future when her parents brought up the topic. Fortunately, the verdict took only a few minutes. They were both given sentences ranging from 15 years to life in prison. Basil Smith expressed his sympathy for their situation and said he would review the court records in search of a path to appeal. Once the sentencing was completed, things moved very quickly. Within 3 days, the two convicts were transferred from the local detention center to the state prison. The women's prison Lisa was sent to had a reasonable reputation, but the same couldn't be said for the prison Blake was sent to. There have been several riots there in the last few years. Now that the trial and sentencing were over, local media no longer covered the case. Recent reports on local television stations showed scenes of prisoners being transported on a converted school bus to a state prison. It may even have been archival footage used to fill out short reports describing the destinations of two convicted criminals. Within days, there were new disasters to cover and fresh crimes to grab the attention of news anchors. It seemed as if Lisa Evans and Blake Moore had disappeared from the face of the earth. About a couple of months after the verdict, Basil Smith joined Jeff Bagden for a drink after a new case brought them together again. The Evans murder case haunted Basil Smith from time to time, and he told Jeff, "You really went after them. To be honest, I was surprised when the guilty verdicts came out. I came to the conclusion that they were most likely innocent, since they never deviated from their stories." Jeff mulled over his brandy before answering. 12 of their peers didn't believe their explanation. I try not to take these cases personally, although that is almost impossible to do when the crimes are too horrific. This case was not the worst I have ever tried, but it was not a case for which I could feel much sympathy for the defendants. Everything works if we accept the jury's decision. Basil Smith considered his interlocutor's statement and said, "I think you are right, but the matter still bothers me." About a year later, there was a small news story about a major disturbance at the men's prison. One name stood out as Basil Smith read the article, and it made him think about the case again. Blake Moore was shot during the riot and was transferred to a hospital for treatment. The article said he was under guard, but would survive. It has been almost 18 months since Lisa Evans and Blake Moore were sentenced for the murder of Mark Evans. Enough time had passed that even Basil Smith rarely remembered the case that had troubled him during his first year of representing the defendants. He carefully checked the transcripts several times in his spare time, but found no legal basis for filing an appeal. There was no error of law that he could exploit in favor of the two convicted murderers. It was a relatively quiet Wednesday morning at the Innocence Project's New York City offices. The secretary had just returned from her morning coffee break and decided to check her appearance in a small mirror when a FedEx courier approached her desk with a package. It was one of those large padded envelopes that are regularly used for interoffice delivery of information and products that business and industry simply can't do without, and that had to be delivered yesterday. The secretary signed the electronic panel that was offered to her and then watched as a pumped-up young man, dressed in a summer uniform, a shirt and shorts, left the office. The exact nature of her thoughts were known only to her, but the mischievous smile on her face could have given a clue to anyone who witnessed the event. In this case, the only person in the reception area was an attractive young black woman sitting at the secretary's desk. The package was simply addressed to the office, so she opened it to determine how to dispose of its contents. Inside, she found a DVD, a sealed black plastic biohazard bag, and a multi-page letter. Since she had nothing urgent to do at the moment, she began to read the letter. It took her several minutes to read it, and the range of emotions that crossed her face as she read it would have aroused the interest of any observer. No one had entered the office since the hunky FedEx delivery guy left, so her expressive reactions went unnoticed. When she finished reading the letter, she thought for a moment before picking up the phone and pressing one of the intercom buttons, waiting a few seconds and then saying, "Tony, could you come here for a minute? We just received a package that I think you might be interested in." She listened for almost 15 seconds before she continued, "Yes, this does seem like something the team could work on. This concerns two murder convictions which obviously should be overturned." About a minute later, a tall, red-haired young man wearing a short white shirt and a pair of worn jeans came out of one of the offices overlooking the reception area, thanked her, took the package, and disappeared again through the door from which he had come. This comfortably dressed young man was Tony Kelly, a recent law school graduate who had decided to devote some time to the public good before chasing a high-paying assistant position at a Wall Street firm. He worked at the Innocence Project for almost a year, doing mostly basic legal research for the more established lawyers who started the office a few years ago. Although he knew he wouldn't stay there for his entire career, he enjoyed making a difference in the lives of those who had been wrongfully convicted of serious crimes. Returning to the comfortable swivel chair behind the relatively cheap laminated desk, he placed the contents of the FedEx envelope on his desk and picked up the letter, glancing briefly at the DVD and sealed package. He turned his chair so he could lean back and rest his night-clad feet on the corner of the table while he read the letter. It was clearly printed on the computer in an easy-to-read font, and he quickly became immersed in its contents. The Innocence Project, New York City. murder convictions for Lisa Evans and Blake Moore. I don't know where to start, so I'll start from the beginning. This way I can keep everything in chronological order and hopefully not forget anything important. My name is not important, but the information I am tasked with conveying to you could significantly change the lives of not only the two convicted murderers above, but also the well-being and happiness of 5 others, including myself. Let me start by saying that almost 15 months ago, a man came to our office in response to an ad I had placed in our local newspaper. I was looking for a computer-savvy person to work for my small computer company. A short interview revealed that he knew at least as much about computers and their use in business networks as I did. I have since learned that he knows even more than me. Anyway, I hired him right away. This man, whom I will call Mark throughout this letter, was probably the quietest person I have met in a long time. It didn't affect his ability to do his job, which he did very, very well. Within 2 months, my business grew at least 50% thanks to his efforts, advice, and the long hours of work he seemed to think was necessary. When he started working for me, he said that he had just arrived in the city and had not yet rented a house. Since my business was still going through the struggles of getting started, I was thinking about renting out a room in the basement of our house for extra income. I wanted to reinvest the profits from my business into growing it so that it would ultimately provide a living for me and my young son. I knew I was taking a small risk by renting this room to Mark, but there was something about him that convinced me he wasn't a threat to us. We began to live in a routine that continues to this day, although the dynamics of our relationship have changed. He spent the first 3 months in that basement room, although he ate with us and we went to work and back together every day. In the beginning, he always returned to the office to work extra hours, for which he did not ask for payment. He always said that he preferred to spend his time productively rather than in front of the TV or sleeping. Over time, our relationship changed from boss and subordinate to friendship and eventually to what it is now, loving family relationships. My son calls him Daddy, and he truly is in every way. From the very beginning, I knew something was weighing heavily on Mark. Over time, his extremely quiet nature and frequent habit of getting lost in deep thought about things I knew nothing about led to a confrontation of sorts between us. One afternoon, when the office was very quiet, I locked the door and called him into my office. I was determined to find out what was bothering him so much as I began to realize how strongly my feelings for him had developed. It took some time, but I convinced him to share what was bothering him. He finally told me that he was running from a broken marriage that had shaken him to the core. He said that his wife betrayed him with a good friend and that he almost committed murder and suicide because of it. We continued to talk for the rest of the day, sharing our feelings about cheating spouses. My husband left me for another woman, and Mark left his wife because of her relationship with another man. We shared common ground, and our conversation seemed to somehow help him overcome one of the last barriers to overcoming his past. This conversation also seemed to be the catalyst that brought us closer together. We started dating on weekends, maintaining 2 separate relationships, boss and subordinate during the week, and man and woman on Saturday evenings. After a month of this, there was no point in maintaining his bedroom in the basement, and he moved into my bedroom with me. From then on, we became a family, although there were still times when I felt like he was hiding something from me. We continued to evolve as a couple. I know I love him, and I'm sure he loves me and my son. I really have to say our son because that's how he feels about him. The boy was about to turn 4 and needed a loving relationship with his father, something his biological father was completely unable to provide. He hasn't seen his biological father since he was a baby, too young to remember him. So we found ourselves 4 days ago when Mark fainted at work. It took 3 days in intensive care for doctors to determine that the problem was with his heart and that he would need open heart surgery to correct the congenital condition. When his condition stabilized, he was transferred to a separate ward. He was conscious, and we could finally talk. When I first walked into his room, I knew something was wrong, and it was bothering him greatly. That's when he told me this story, a story he feared would die with him if he didn't undergo heart surgery. It is very important for him to finally close this chapter of his life. He told me this story all day today, and when I agreed to print it for him and make sure it got into your hands, it felt like a weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. Now he is sleeping, and I am sitting at my laptop and typing this letter, and our son, that is, our son, is also sleeping next to him. I think I will have almost all night to finish this letter. I will still need to get home and make a DVD, which I will talk about later, and I also need to pick up a few other items before I can send this information to you. I really want to post this by noon tomorrow. We also need to overcome the problem of sending it from a location that won't allow you to track it back to us. The story that my husband told me, and for me that's exactly what he is, began almost 2 years ago. He was happily married to Lisa, and their marriage had almost reached its 6-year anniversary. One night, after they had been making love, Lisa fell asleep naked on the bed next to him. He doesn't understand why it caught his attention, but he noticed a small oval bruise on her right breast. At first, he thought it was just a bruise from a blow, something that happened when she bumped into the corner of furniture at home or in the office where she worked part-time as a secretary. He said it started to bother him as he lay there because it looked more like a kiss mark than a bruise, and he knew he didn't leave it. Thinking about it kept him up most of the night as his mind imagined more and more erotic scenarios about how this bruise could have happened. The next day, it was still on his mind when he went to work. By the time he got to his office, he decided he was being stupid. After all, he had absolutely no evidence of anything wrong. He decided that it was all just an accident. Shortly before lunch, the manager of the parts delivery department came into his office. The man ordered a tracking device for trial use to better coordinate their delivery fleet. He wanted Mark to evaluate him and give his recommendations. Mark was left with the device, the software, and all the instructions for using it. It didn't take him long to decide how he would test it. 3 days after installing the device in his wife's car, he was sitting at his desk and decided to check the monitoring program to see if it was still tracking his wife's car. She told him she was going to go shopping that day, but the tracking device showed that she left the house and went straight to the house of Blake Moore, his best friend. An hour later, he checked again, and her car was still there. He didn't really believe that something was happening, so he called her on her cell phone. When she told him she was shopping, he immediately knew something was seriously wrong. That night, he randomly asked her about her day and was forced to listen to her explain about the purchases she made. He told me that he felt almost physically ill, but he decided that he should not immediately jump to conclusions. He decided to keep an eye on her for another week while he was on a business trip. He was able to follow her car across 3 states while she spent from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. at Blake's house. When he spoke to her the next day, she told him that she had been at home the entire previous evening. The shock of confirmation of her infidelity was almost unbearable for him. When he returned from a business trip, he thought about murder. He knew that his friend Blake was a real ladies' man, but he never thought that he would set his sights on Lisa. Likewise, his wife's betrayal almost broke his heart. That first night he was home, he visited an elderly widow who lived next door, ostensibly to borrow a wrench from her late husband's toolkit. Mark knew that her late husband had long ago hidden a gun in the bottom of his large toolbox, apparently because his wife had forbidden him to keep a gun in the house. One day he showed it to Mark when they were drinking beer together. Instead of taking a pipe wrench, Mark found and took a revolver from the toolbox. As he explained to me, his intention was to kill Blake and Lisa and then commit suicide. He decided to wait until the next time they met while he was in town. It would have been easy for him to leave work and go to Blake's to catch them together and then carry out his final revenge. Because he needed to monitor his wife's car for a few weeks, he ordered one of the tracking devices for himself so he could return the one he was given for evaluation. He's lucky Lisa and Blake didn't set up the meeting for another week, because if they had, my son and I would never have met Mark. During the days he had to wait for them to meet again, he came up with a better plan. He decided to try to frame them for murder and described to me how he did it. It took him a whole week to come up with a plan, and another week to gather everything he needed to implement it. When he was ready, he made up an excuse to be away for the weekend, confident that they would meet while he was out of town. After keeping an eye on his wife's car while he was gone, he finally saw her leave their house and drive to Blake's. This was a signal to action. He prepared evidence that indicated that he was allegedly in the process of divorcing his wife. The final element was an email to his lawyer that would point directly to Lisa and Blake. Apparently, he almost forgot to send it, which could mean the whole plan would fall apart. The last thing he did before leaving his home was to use a neighbor's revolver to shoot the passenger seat of his car and another of the wood blocks he had collected. The sound of gunfire was muffled by an old blanket and the fact that he was inside a closed garage. He told me that shooting these targets was a huge relief for him because he knew that he had finally begun the path to his revenge. You should really look for archived newspaper articles that are available online. Mark followed the trial daily online and said much of the history of what he did was written by court reporters. When he started telling me what he had done, it sounded like one long story. I didn't want to interrupt him, so there may be details that I forget to include here. Also obtain a copy of the court transcript. Mark thinks that they should all clear things up together. First, he drove his car to a park near Blake's house and found a secluded place where he could work on staging his death. He had a large duffel bag full of everything he needed for the plan, and he laid everything out on the picnic table, which he covered with an old blanket. One of the first things he did was unload pieces of firewood, plastic sheeting, and a spare tire. He used plastic on which he stacked pieces of firewood and a spare tire to create an obvious drag mark that led to a paved road. After that, the wheel went back into the trunk, the firewood was placed around the picnic area, and the plastic was packed back. He used a small Maglite flashlight for all of this, and when he was done, he sat quietly at the table to see if anyone would come after noticing the flashes of light that occurred while he was setting everything up. Sitting there, he inserted a large blood collection needle into his left arm. He managed to purchase medical supplies from a medical supply store when he told them he was caring for his elderly mother. It took him over an hour to collect what he thought was almost 2 pints of evidence. He needs rest as his heart surgery is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. I pray that there are no complications and that he makes it through the surgery. Regardless of whether I have conveyed all the details correctly, there is still a question about the DVD that I am going to make for you. Mark took photos, sort of before and after, with his digital camera while he was doing all this in the park. Apparently, the photos are pretty good, even though he had to take them by the light of his small flashlight. He was afraid that someone would see the flash if he used the flash on his camera. Anyway, when he was done with the car and the evidence at the park, he packed everything back into his duffel bag and walked out of the park. He had an old car that he bought for this purpose sitting on a side street, and he told me that he barely made it to the car. Although he drank plenty of fluids and took supplements, he still felt very dizzy when he got to the car. He rested in the car until 6 o'clock in the morning, but knew that he still needed to go to Blake's house to finish what he started. Lisa's car was still there, which he didn't expect, and it was unlocked. He decided that this was a real bonus, as he was able to leave a few clues on the gas pedal. As he walked from Lisa's car to Blake's car, he noticed a faint light in Blake's bedroom and became very afraid that one of them might have seen it. After Blake's house, he went to the telephone booth on the opposite side of the park. Shortly after sunrise, he used a payphone to call 911 to report his car in the park. He set up a professional model of voice changer purchased from a spy shop in Pittsburgh and used it to make them think it was a woman calling. This worked quite well as it allowed him to change the timbre, tone, and pitch of his voice. From there, he walked to a dock on the river, where he threw 2 Blake scoops and a revolver into the water. By the time he did all this, he said he felt very tired. He thinks it was just the adrenaline of knowing that nothing had gone seriously wrong with his plan that had kept him going until this point. About a mile away, there was a small motel where he had already rented a room, and he went there to stay out of sight and rest. He spent 2 days there, taking supplements and eating energy bars. I was a little confused about the timing, but at some point he came out again with the voice changer and made another call, this time like an old man. The call was used to direct police to the revolver he had discarded. That's all he told me, I think. I'll read it to him in the morning and correct any mistakes. I really hope that when he sees that everything is ready to print, he will be much more relaxed. The whole reason he told me this story and insisted that I send it to you is because he wants to sever the last ties that keep him in his old life as Mark Evans. Somewhere along the way before he got here, he acquired the identity that he now uses and that my son and I know. He wants to keep that identity and never be Mark Evans again. Please do everything you can to overturn the convictions of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore. Tomorrow, I'm going to buy a copy of the New York Times and a stamp pad. We'll use a piece of the first page to leave all of Mark's fingerprints where they can be clearly seen. Then we will make a large stain on the newspaper. When this is matched with DNA from the park, it will be proof that he is alive. All this should be enough to free them. This completes the computer letter, but adds another handwritten message at the bottom. Mark came out of surgery in very good condition. He wants me to fly to Seattle tomorrow to send this package. I hate leaving him, but I know he will feel much better once this is sent. I told you earlier that this would affect the 5 of us, but I see that I never explained what I meant. Mark and I are expecting twins in about 3 months. Tony Kelly turned the last page to see if anything had been added on the back, but it was blank. He lifted his feet from the corner of the table and turned to look at the other items in the package. The DVD was labeled Photographs Taken at George Washington Park. On the back of the black plastic bag was written Fingerprints and DNA. He glanced at the printed pages again, checking the back of each for additional entries, and then called one of the senior lawyers. It wasn't something he could decide on his own. It didn't take long to confirm that the DNA was indeed Mark Evans, and fingerprints also confirmed he was alive when they were compared to those taken from his car when it was found at the park. Faced with overwhelming evidence that 2 men had been convicted of a murder that never happened, the state attorney general and the governor expedited their release. Within a week, they were back in the courtroom where they were convicted, along with Basil Smith, Lisa's parents, and even District Attorney Jeff Bugden and some government officials. The state's attorney general apologized to the court system and state for their unfair conviction. He also said that there was no doubt that the blame for this entire unfortunate affair lay on the shoulders of Mark Evans. The judicial system worked, but was led astray from the path of justice by the focused efforts of a determined man. He then announced that their office would make every effort to find Mark Evans and hold him accountable for the significant amount of money he caused the city and state to spend. The costs of the police, forensics, trial, and imprisonment were being calculated, and he intended to recover them. Charges will also be filed. However, when a reporter asked him if they had any idea where to start looking for Mark Evans, he simply shook his head. Blake Moore seemed to undergo a personality change. The self-confident and overconfident man was replaced by someone who seemed much more willing to compromise. He apologized to Lisa for causing the events that led to their nearly 1.5 years in prison. Lisa seemed indifferent, neither one way nor the other. She looked completely devastated, caring only about leaving the courtroom with her parents as quickly as possible. Before they left, and Basil Smith and the district attorney added their apologies for what happened. Both lawyers felt they had been seriously deceived by Mark Evans' manipulations. They both felt that they should have been smarter so as not to fall for the tricks of their vindictive husband. Later, both thought to themselves that they would have to be much more attentive to the details of future affairs. Although the Attorney General believed the state had no liability, Lisa and Blake were each paid $50,000 after signing a waiver of any further legal action or damages. Shortly after receiving his check, Blake Moore left town. His business went bankrupt and his house was sold to pay legal fees. There was nothing left for him to do here. His only comment to Lisa after they were handed the checks was, "Mark really screwed us over, didn't he? This check is only a fraction of what my house and business would be worth if he hadn't found out about us. I hate to say I warned you, but I knew he set us up." Lisa was still only a shadow of her former self. She lost the house she and Mark owned due to non-payment and repossession. She also lost weight in prison, but developed what might be called worry lines that weren't there before. She seemed hopelessly lost and accepted her check as if it were nothing more than a piece of paper. Stuffing it into her purse, she said, "I think maybe we deserve this, Blake. I don't care about time in jail. It only cost me 18 months of my life, but I lost Mark forever." She left with her parents without even saying goodbye. 2 weeks after news channels reported on Lisa and Blake's release, a large package arrived by courier at the office of lawyer Basil Smith. Inside was a short note to the lawyer and a sealed envelope addressed to Lisa Evans. He made an appointment to deliver her letter on his way home. At exactly 5 p.m., the lawyer knocked on Lisa's apartment. After a short and polite conversation, he left her standing at the door, looking at the envelope with worry and a little hope. Finally, after she brought it into the kitchen and stared at it for a few more seconds, she opened it. The familiar handwriting on the envelope told her it was from Mark, and she knew she just had to read what he wrote. "Lisa, I would like to apologize for allowing you to spend so long in prison. I've never been vindictive before, but the betrayal from you and Blake almost drove me crazy. My new life and the happiness I have found has finally made me realize that until I free you both, I am just as much a prisoner as you. I know that the authorities will be looking for me for some time, but I am confident that I am safe in my new life, with my new family. Good luck and goodbye, M." The short letter fell from her hand and fell to the floor, taking with it the last faint hope of reconciliation with Mark.